Thank you all for standing by and welcome to the last webinar in our series this year, Religion, Environmental Ethics, and Climate Change. These webinars are created by the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team, a multi-departmental effort within the university led by Ohio State University Extension, Ohio Sea Grant, Bird Polar Research Center, and 6 other OSU departments to help localize the climate change issue for Ohioans and Great Lakes residents. I am Ann Baird from Ohio State University Extension and the School of Environment and Natural Resources. A few logistical aspects. During our presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Afterwards, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Please submit a question at any time during the webinar. I will gather and pose those questions to our speaker at the end of his presentation. We have more than 50 participants on this webinar, a great diverse group. Feel free to keep the questions coming throughout the presentation, and we will have an excellent question and answer session. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website for later viewing. We will have a short online evaluation at the end of the webinar, and we would appreciate it if you would take the time to fill that out. Your responses will help us continue to bring better webinars. Without any further delay, I would like to introduce Dr. Greg Hitzhusen, who will present Religion, Environmental Ethics, and Climate Change. Greg is a lecturer in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University and serves as board chair of Ohio Interfaith Power and Light. Thanks, Greg. Why don't you go ahead and start?
Great. Thank you, Ann. And I'm really glad to be presenting this webinar. I was thinking about this, and I think this might be the largest group of people that I can't see who I've ever presented a PowerPoint to. And my topic, Religion, Environmental Ethics, and Climate Change, involves a couple of those things that people say that you shouldn't discuss in polite company, namely religion and politics. But I've seen a list of the registrants, and I'm impressed by the wide range of organizations and expertise represented in the audience. So I'm imagining you all as not only polite company, but thoughtful company, and I look forward to your comments and questions at the end of the webinar. I want to get started by giving just a quick outline of what I'll cover over this time. I'll look a little bit at some of the general religious concern for environment and climate change. I'll specifically focus a little bit more on climate change as a moral issue. I'll look at some of the trends and tensions that we've seen in this around the country particularly, and then look at some examples of response in action of faith communities responding to climate change. When we talk about climate change and environmental concerns in religious communities, one thing that's clear is that major world religious leaders are really taking this seriously. A good example is Pope Benedict gave his World Day of Peace message on the first of the year this year, and it was titled, "If you want to cultivate peace, protect creation," and he's been a champion for a lot of issues around climate change. We know that the Dalai Lama has pushed for climate legislation. We know that the Green Patriarch Bartholomew, who is the leader of the Orthodox Church in the world, is called the Green Patriarch because of the attention he's given to environmental issues, including climate change. Ismar Shorsh has been a leader in the Jewish community as president of Jewish Theological Seminary in drawing attention to environmental issues. Rick Warren, we know as the pastor of Saddleback Church and the author of The Purpose-Driven Life, who is one of the signers of the Evangelical Climate Initiative. And Catherine Jefferts Shorey, some of you may know, is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the U.S., and she, of course, has testified before Congress in recent years about climate change issues. So it's been a matter of principal concern for religious leaders. One of the more interesting things that I've seen about climate change and different religious leaders is this particular campaign by the We campaign, an ad with Al Sharpton and Pat Robertson on a couch together, and I'm going to try to cue this up and show this.
Al, let's face it, we're polar opposites.
We couldn't be further apart. I'm on the left.
And I'm usually right. And we strongly disagree.
Except on one issue. Tell them what it is, Reverend Pat.
That would be our planet Taking care of it is extremely important.
We all need to work together, liberals and conservatives.
So get involved. It's the right thing to do.
Now there you go again.
Join us. Together we can solve the climate crisis. Go to wecansolveit.org.
Back to the presentation here. So I'm not sure that that's entirely typical of every interaction you'll ever see between pastors or people who are politically conservative or politically liberal about climate change, but we've seen that kind of thing, and it certainly has been an interesting issue evolving over the past few years. I want to begin with a little bit of an overview of some of the activity we've seen in religious communities around this, and I want to start with what is the largest religious denomination in the world, the Roman Catholic Church. And first of all, to look at the fact that in Catholic social teaching there are 7 main themes, one of which is care for God's creation. And this may come as a surprise to some Catholics, but it's been a real focus, particularly lately, to look at how care for creation is one of those social issues that Catholics should be concerned with. The Vatican has tried to take leadership on climate change, vying to become the world's first carbon-neutral state in the last couple of years. They were doing that by reestablishing a forest in Hungary, and also by putting solar panels on an auditorium roof. This slide will come up. That would allow them to meet the European Union goals for carbon neutrality. And they've also talked about making a solar farm on their Vatican radio properties. And there was a social statement that came out that actually listed environmental pollution as one of the contemporary social sins. More recently, our own Dr. Lonnie Thompson at Ohio State Bird Polar Research Center was part of a working group convened by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to look at glacier melt and the issues of climate change for water supplies for people who rely upon high mountain glaciers. And they came out with a pretty strong statement just this May, calling on all peoples, all nations to really work together to address these very serious issues. Another interesting example we've seen from the Anglican Church in the UK, this was a resource that was created during Lent a few years back as a carbon fast in response to climate change, and all Anglicans were called upon to consider this discipline for the Lenten season of reducing carbon emissions in their own life as a Lenten discipline. The Coalition on the Environment in Jewish Life has also had several initiatives related to climate change, and here you see the low-watt Shabbat, trying to focus on various aspects of energy efficiency and conservation during Shabbat. Georgia Interfaith Power and Light put together this resource for Hanukkah, which, as you can see, you have the CFL bulbs on the menorah here. Again, focusing on sort of the miracle of light, if you will. Hopefully those bulbs will last at least 10 times longer than incandescents. But those kinds of resources have come out in the faith communities. This one also is sponsored in part by the Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Environmental Sciences, created this guide to reducing climate change for Muslim communities with lots of tips for things that can be done in the home and in the mosque and in the communities. Another interesting example that some of you may have heard of was in Thailand, where Buddhist monks who were trying to respond to the illegal logging of old-growth forests, particularly because we know how important forests are to sequestering carbon, they wanted to save these trees from illegal logging, and so they went into the forest and ordained the trees as monks and put the robes around the trees to signify that. And in many cases, apparently, when the loggers came into the forest and saw the robes around the trees, they refused to cut the trees down. So there's been that kind of example as well in other parts of the world. Here in the U.S., we had a similar sort of example with the last remaining stand of monumental old-growth redwoods that was in private hands. The Maxim Corporation owned that, and people were trying to get that preserved. It turned out that the owner of the company was Jewish, and so a number of rabbis who became known as the Redwood Rabbis went out to California to appeal to the owner's better Jewish sensibilities in preserving the forest. I think in the end he got a really nice settlement to keep from cutting down the trees, but that was part of the effort here. There's also been some interesting attention paid, and oftentimes people are most particularly interested to see the response in American evangelical Christian communities. One organization that a lot of people don't know a lot about is the Southern Baptist Environment and Climate Initiative at this website here. And more of an umbrella organization, the National Association of Evangelicals, also has done some important environmental work recently. Back in 2005, 2006, they came out with a new evangelical call to civic responsibility, which, similar to the tenets of Catholic social teaching, has 7 major pillars, and again, one of which is protecting God's creation. And so we're seeing across religious communities attention to protecting creation, which includes concern for climate change as one of the major tenets of religious life. Another initiative within this community is something that's become known as the Friendship Collaborative, which brings together climate scientists and evangelical clergy, the first of which was in Georgia in 2006 with such leading scientists as E.O. Wilson, and Jim Hansen, Carl Safina, Gus Speth, Peter Raven, and others, meeting with leading evangelicals. And then 2 follow-up events from that happened here in Ohio, one at the University of Akron in 2007 and one here at OSU in 2009. And these were dialogues between evangelical pastors and climate scientists. Moving to the more sensational, maybe a lot of people have seen this because it received a lot of media attention, was the What Would Jesus Drive campaign, which started as an interfaith group of Jews and mainline Protestants and Catholics going to the big 3 automakers in Detroit to talk about auto emissions in concern for air quality and for climate change. And of course, the media has had a heyday with this one. As a bike commuter, I personally like the "Why Would Jesus Drive" bumper sticker here, but that's been another thing. Here in Ohio, many of you may know our own Solar Nun, a co-founder of Ohio Interfaith Power and Light, Sister Paula Gonzalez, who is a Sister of Charity in the Cincinnati area. And we think that her particular response to What Would Jesus Drive is apparently a solar-powered golf cart, which is how she gets around. So lots of interesting responses. More seriously, beyond just sort of the initiatives and the activist responses that we've seen within the religious communities, there's been very serious theological engagement around topics of the environment over the course of the last 40, 50 years. And I did a study of the American Theological Library Association's database. This is the online database of the theological literature. And if you look at this, even back in the 1960s, there was a fair amount of publishing that was focused on ecology and environment, but nothing compared to what happened after the original Earth Day in 1970, a huge jump in publishing, which was probably matched in all fields as people became interested in environment generally as a topic. And then another big jump, and this increase has just continued until the present day, but this jump in the late 1980s followed several different occasions and events. One was the convening of the North American Conference on Christianity and Ecology in the mid to late 1980s, which also precipitated the formation of the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. And this was also the time in the early 1990s when the American Academy of Religion was forming a religion and ecology group, which started to bring more attention within academic circles to questions of ecology and theology. And so this movement within religious communities to address concerns of the environment, including climate change, has really been seriously studied at the deepest levels of training for clergy, and we're beginning to see a transformation of what religious leaders are learning as they go through their own education to become clergy. I mentioned the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, and for those who are not familiar with it, it's a partnership of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops Environmental Justice Program, and the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops is the policy-making arm for the Catholic Church in the United States, so that includes all Catholic parishes in the U.S. Another partner is the Evangelical Environmental Network, which is a network of different evangelical organizations like InterVarsity and World Vision, Habitat for Humanity, and others, and other parachurch organizations. And the Evangelical Environmental Network as well collaborates with the National Association of Evangelicals in environmental work. And the National Association of Evangelicals is the 30 million Americans on the conservative right of the political spectrum religiously. The National Council of Churches of Christ has eco-justice programs, and the National Council of Churches is composed of the 34 mainline Protestant denominations, also includes the Greek Orthodox, historically black churches, and the Quakers, so a very diverse group of denominations. And then the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life, which encompasses Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist Judaism in the United States. So this kind of development among faith communities in response to environment has been impressive to many in the environmental field and has led more than a few people to wonder what the environmental magazine wondered here on their cover, whether religion can save the environment. And I have to admit that this kind of a perspective makes me a little bit nervous. Anytime someone looks for a silver bullet or a single answer to problems, especially something as complex as climate change, I think we have to look very carefully at that and scrutinize that. I'm much more comfortable with the notion that says that in addition to good policy and good science and other good social institutions, there is a particular role for religious communities to play in addressing an issue like climate change. And I think that Gus Speth has put it very well. Gus Speth was retired recently as the Dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He was also the first advisor to a U.S. president on climate and energy issues and the founder of the Natural Resources Defense Council, among other things. Some people think of him as sort of the insider's insider in environmental science. But he makes this comment that particularly back when he was working in the administration, he felt that the big three, climate, biodiversity, and pollution, he felt that those would be solved with better science and better policy. And he says now that looking back after 30 years, he realizes that while we've made some progress on some issues, in many other ways we have bigger challenges now than we had before. And so Speth says that he thinks now that the big three are pride, apathy, and greed as even bigger problems. And of course, science doesn't really address pride, apathy, and greed as directly as it does other things. And so Speth's comment, he actually made this comment directly to the evangelical leaders at that retreat in Georgia back in 2006. He said, what we need in these cases is more of a cultural and spiritual transformation. And that's not something science does, and that is something that faith communities do and are particularly involved in. And so I think that is a nice statement of where some people have decided that faith communities have a particular role to play, and it's a role in the realm of morals and ethics as lived by different faith communities. Now, this is particularly important in North America because, as we all know, North America is a very religious place. In the United States in particular, these are just the results of 4 different major surveys of religion looking at demographics in the United States of percentages of self-reported Christians, Protestants, Catholics, other Christians, Jewish, Muslims, non-affiliated, and others, which is just to say that you see these numbers that the United States is a highly religious country with a high level of involvement of people involved in religious communities. Those who are active on a weekly basis is more along the lines of 50%, but it's still a highly religious country. And at the same time, the world is also a highly religious place. If we look here at the numbers for different religions around the world, and even in this case, some people will look at the non-religious category at 16%, but full half of this category is still theistic but not religious. So the sense that people have religiously around the world is still a huge influence. Religious communities are everywhere we go, in some places more influential than in other places. But to the extent that religion has an influence in various cultures around the world and in various cultures in the United States, it is an important issue in dealing with something like climate change. So particularly the aspects of climate change that are the moral aspects of climate change, this is where faith communities tend to weigh in most heavily. And one way of looking at that, there's a book out recently called Moral Ground that's been put together by Kathleen Dean Moore and Michael Nelson, which looks at climate change and the planet and asked moral leaders from around the world. They contacted over 120 moral leaders in the world to get their response on if and why climate change is a moral issue. And the response was an overwhelming yes, that this is definitely a moral issue, and for many reasons. For one, thinking about the world for our children's sake and for future generations is a main reason people cite. Also just for basic human survival. People talk about the sake of the earth and of all life, or for even a love of the earth and life. A lot of people mention the fact that our very moral integrity and for the exercise of our fullest capacities for virtue is also one of the reasons to respond appropriately to climate change. Some people look at climate change as a moral issue because life is beautiful, and if creation is degraded, then we're not honoring that beauty. There's also a strong strand in many religious communities that look at the fact that life is a gift. Life is not something that we have made, but rather a gift from God, and that raises an obligation of gratitude, the only appropriate response to a gift being gratitude. It also raises the question of stewardship. If we've been given this gift of creation and been given a responsibility to care for it, then that's our stewardship obligation, which many religious leaders point to that. Others talked about the honor that's due to the great evolved life systems of Earth. If over the long course of evolution, all that has evolved, there's respect to that. Also, similarly, an obligation to diversity and to all the great creatures. People will point to the creation stories of the biblical traditions, where the Creator created all of life, and at each stage of creation, on each day of creation, stepped back and saw that it was good. Created the plants, saw that they were good. Created the animals, saw that they were good. Blessed the animals to be fruitful and multiply. And so all of these creatures have been made with a blessing to be fruitful, and humans are not to impinge on that fruitfulness. There's also a basic sense of compassion, a duty of compassion to prevent suffering to the extent that we can, that people will cite. Also, in light of the fact that some cultures, whether it's Pacific Islanders being flooded out of their home islands or others, people have a right to their cultures which are being destroyed. And something I'll say a little bit more about as we go on, the theme of justice, in that the impacts of climate change fall disproportionately on the poor and vulnerable, and that this is a particularly moral issue that most religious communities have picked up on and elucidated in their concerns. Another way to look at this, in terms of it being a moral issue, is just to look at some of the differences in per capita carbon dioxide emissions. We know that carbon dioxide is a major greenhouse warming gas and a major concern in climate change. And so if we look at the average person in China, this is from 2008 data of 4.91, and then we compare that to some Japan, you get about a doubling there, and Germany, and now, I suppose you're all sitting down, hold on to your seats, here comes the United States, and here's the U.S. per capita carbon dioxide emissions. And when you look at this, one of the things that I always notice is a lot of people will say that, well, we don't want to have to be restricted in our use of energy too much because that's where our quality of life comes from. But when you compare the quality of life and the standard of living in the United States to that in Japan and Germany, who have half the carbon footprint that we do, you have to think that, well, in fact, they have a better standard of living in terms of life expectancy and health indices and a whole number of measures, so that we're not living better than them by consuming twice as much energy as them. And another way to look at this is to realize that whatever it might be worth, Japan and Germany are twice as efficient as we are in the United States. And if they can be that efficient, so can we. I suppose the alternative way to look at that is to say that here in the U.S. we're twice as wasteful as others. And I'm not really sure of any wisdom tradition that encourages waste as a good way to live. Another way we can look at this as a moral issue, I don't know if you've seen, there's a website out there where you can pull up just about any demographic figure, and then it will be represented on the map in terms of the area of various countries. So, for instance, if the U.S. is 4% or 4.5% of the world's population, then the United States area on this map is 4% of the total area of this map. So now we're going to toggle from our population, and of course, look at the size of India, of course, population. We're going to toggle now to CO2. Keep your eyes on the U.S. And there we go. Somewhere between 25 and 30% of the world's CO2 emissions come from the U.S. So take a look at that again. The U.S. in terms of our population and in terms of our share of CO2 emissions. Kind of feels a little bit bloated, I think. Take a look over at Africa, too. Look at what happens to Africa and CO2 emissions. It almost disappears. Population for Africa, and then you move to CO2 emissions. And of course, this is one of the major concerns is as people in places like Africa have done almost nothing to contribute to CO2 emissions and greenhouse warming gases, but they're bearing the brunt of the impacts at this point in time. So, for instance, whether that's the more intensified monsoon season in a place like Bangladesh, and where flooding will keep millions of Bangladeshis out of their homes during the flooding season, or whether that's Pacific Islanders who not just facing the need to potentially evacuate their homelands as sea level rises and makes it impossible to live there, but even prior to that, seeing the inundation of their freshwater reserves by saltwater and making it impossible to live there as well. And, of course, one of the places that's a real concern is the continent of Africa. And what we see there is levels of drought lately that are a major concern because such a high percentage of Africans have agricultural livelihoods. And, of course, it's one thing to be in a place where if your crop fails, you've got a subsidy or somebody can just buy elsewhere on the global food market. But for most African farmers who live on the margins, that amount of drought is going to be the difference between their livelihood or not in a given season. And so we see, particularly among African farmers, the brunt of climate change with warmer temperatures is really falling heavily. Of course, we don't have to look all around the world. We can also look, when we look at Hurricane Katrina and what happened in New Orleans, we, of course, don't say that climate change caused the hurricane, but we do say that the hurricane was more intense because of the warmer oceans and shifts in climate. And the people who were least able to respond and adapt and deal easily were, of course, the poor and vulnerable in New Orleans. And so this is a major concern of who is impacted most by these impacts of climate change. And so, for instance, one of the recent responses to climate change was a letter from the Catholic bishops in February of 2011 to Congress making several points about the issue of climate change. One of the main tenets that Catholics and others, religious communities, have made in response to climate science is that prudence, the virtue of prudence, requires us to act because as we look at the information, at the risks that we're facing, and at the impacts that we currently see, it is only prudent to take action quickly so that these impacts don't get even worse. We see again that they reinforce the point about the poor and the vulnerable, and again that the longer we wait to act, the larger those impacts become and the greater the injustice as a result. But at the same time, there's a keen awareness that it can go both ways. Here in Ohio, we have a heavy dependence on coal for our electricity. Almost 90% of our electricity comes from coal. And to shift away from a CO2-intensive source of energy like coal in a state like Ohio is no small challenge. And if coal-based electricity becomes more expensive from climate legislation, then those costs will be borne disproportionately again by the poor and vulnerable who may not have as much money to pay those higher prices. And so it's very important, and this has been something that religious communities have said repeatedly, is that climate change policies need to take that into account and not make the economic situation of those who are in poverty or who are struggling economically even worse off. And not only that, domestically, but another major tenet of a lot of lobbying by religious communities around climate change has focused on the need to help with adaptation for those who are already facing the impacts of climate change more than we're seeing them in the United States. And so developing funds to help people in developing nations adapt is an important tenet as well. Another really interesting climate change statement that you maybe have seen was the evangelical call to action on climate change. This one actually caused a little bit of controversy in that some members, leaders within the National Association of Evangelicals did not want this statement to be signed by that group, but other leaders and presidents of that organization were very supportive of it. But note that their four tenets, they start off with what they feel is a really critical point, is that human-induced climate change is real. Just to simply say that it's real is a critically important point. And that is because if it's not real and if it's not mainly human-induced, then what the statement actually says is that it becomes a totally different moral issue. And so everything hinges on the scientific data. And what they go on to say is that they think that now, as evangelicals, we've hesitated to comment boldly on climate change, but now we think that the evidence does demand action. In the face of the breadth and depth of scientific and governmental concern, and they list a small amount of that in the statement, they say, we are convinced that evangelicals must engage this issue without any further lingering over the basic reality of the problem or humanity's responsibility to address it. And so right off the bat, this statement looks to point out and highlight the consensus that has emerged around climate change and that it is human-induced, or some extent of it is human-induced. Also, then, of course, that the consequences are quite significant of climate change. This isn't just small matters, and they hit the poor the hardest. Here again, the same issue of virtue and morality, that as a religious community, the only moral response is to do something to solve these issues, and that the need is actually quite urgent to act now. Speaking of the scientific consensus, I just want to mention this because I think it's important. Again, if the science is not well-founded, well, then that's a totally different matter. And if it isn't the fact that humans are causing some of this, well, then that also is a very different matter. But the consensus is actually quite clear now, as many of you are aware, that the warming we're seeing, particularly lately, is highly unusual, that we're seeing levels of CO2 and warming that are outside of the range that has been experienced by human civilizations in natural cycles. Of course, at the same time, all of those natural cycles, whether that's the sun or volcanoes or just the oscillations of the orbit of the planet and the angle of incidence with the sun, all of these things continue to influence climate, but these are things that are incorporated into the models, and we know pretty particularly that the warming of the last 50 years is primarily human-induced. In fact, we even have chemical footprints of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere and know its source in many cases to know that the industrial sources of CO2 are really causing the changes that we're seeing. So this has become a consensus that's quite robust. And in terms of who agrees with that consensus, in addition to our own climate change science program in this country and our own National Academy of Sciences, along with 32 other nations' Academy of Sciences, and notably, there isn't a National Academy of Sciences anywhere that disagrees with this. We also have every major scientific organization whose members have climate scientists agrees with these conclusions. Interestingly, the only major scientific association that had rejected the idea of human-caused climate change with a statement in 1999 recanted their own rejection in 2007, and actually in 2010 they've sunset their climate change committee, saying that they don't actually have the expertise to comment on this particular issue. So with that change, there are no major scientific organizations left that don't agree with this, or they sort of have a non-committal position now. Another point is, and this has come from a couple of studies, but one recently in 2010 from the National Academy of Sciences, showing that 97 to 98% of climate researchers actively publishing in the field now agree with this consensus. Of course, the Pentagon agrees, companies like Walmart agree, our utilities in this area, like American Electric Power and Duke Energy, have climate change information pages on their websites that agree with this consensus. We know that the Pope agrees and the Dalai Lama agrees. And speaking of those religious communities, every major religious denomination with a climate change statement, except the Southern Baptist Convention, agrees with this consensus. So Catholic Church has made very bold pronouncements about and invoking the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and that science as a basis. Evangelical statements do the same thing. Many of the mainline Protestant denominations have in many cases, multiple resolutions addressing climate change. I think the Presbyterian Church alone has something like 5 different resolutions that deal with climate change, dating back to the 1980s when Jim Hansen was first starting to raise these issues in Congress. So there's been for a long time very strong religious witness about this. But we also know that consensus seems to be more controversial in the general public in the United States. And while this is even a couple of years old now, we know that doubt and skepticism about climate change has been on the rise. Those who think that the seriousness of global warming is exaggerated has been on the rise, and those who say that it's correct or underestimated has been going down. Now, the interesting thing about this, as many people are aware, that this really divides along partisan political lines. And so those who say global warming news exaggerated among Republicans is very high at 66%, where Democrats only have 22%. So it's clear that there's something political in the differences that we see in people's perceptions about the dangers of climate change in this country. There's no doubt about that. And that divide has only gotten worse. This is more recent from the Yale Climate Project, some data from 2010, and seeing that people's perception of whether global warming is happening in 2008 this has diminished now into 2010. And in fact, that's a drop of 14%. There's been some very successful campaigns casting doubt on climate science. And this also is seen a very similar drop. Now, this was a study by Lifeway Research in October of 2010 that saw that the percent of Protestant pastors that they surveyed who felt or who strongly disagreed that global warming is real and man-made, the number who strongly disagreed in 2008 was 27%, and in 2010 was 41%. So this is similarly a 14% jump, very similar to that. That reflects not something theological so much, but something that we're seeing in the wider culture. I did an interview study of a number of the Interfaith Power and Light state directors around the state. I'll say more about Interfaith Power and Light in a moment. But this is the largest faith-based climate change organization in the country with chapters now in 38 states. And I asked those leaders of those state chapters, as they go out and do climate change education in faith communities all around the country, what are the barriers that they are running into to climate change science information? And overwhelmingly, political bias, climate denial, media denials, this kind of influence was the most important things that these leaders have seen as a barrier to climate information, including scientific ignorance. Notably, none of them actually mentioned as a significant barrier theological reasons. So in other words, we're not seeing that there's some theological reason to doubt climate or to worry about or to not worry about climate, but rather it's this political influence. And of course, that's come out lately. Henry Waxman, who is one of the major sponsors of climate legislation in the House, made a really interesting point where he's drawing the parallel with civil rights and saying that there was a right side and a wrong side of history in civil rights, and he's seeing the same thing now in climate change, of feeling like those who are arguing on the other side are actually on the wrong side of history on this, and saying that this really now becomes a moral issue. One of the interesting commentators on this, Donald Brown at Penn State, has a climate ethics website, and he's done a lot of analysis of a lot of the climate legislation. And looking at the Cancun negotiations, he had this piece where he said that climate legislation, if it's going to be ethically acceptable, it's going to have to meet three criteria. One is that it's environmentally sufficient, meaning if legislation is not going to do what needs to be done to drop emissions levels to a safe level, then it's not going to fix the problem environmentally, and that's not sufficient, then that's not ethical. Just adaptation, that criteria echoes again the concern that those who are being heavily impacted by climate change need to be helped in adapting so that it's fair and just. If they've done little to contribute to the problem, but they're bearing the brunt of the impacts, then that's unjust, and we need to help them adapt, those of us in the developed world. And the equity criteria simply calls for those who have contributed most to the problem, nations like the United States, whose cumulative contribution to greenhouse warming gases is something like 30% of the overall world total, that we should clearly have one of the largest roles in responding. And of course, Brown says that Cancun failed to meet these criteria, but even more so, United States Congress, since we have no legislation yet, is failing to meet these criteria. Brown also has some even stronger words about climate ethics, in that he looks at the climate denial campaigns that have been perpetuated in many cases by industries who are being regulated and will be regulated in terms of climate emissions, and feels that some of the misinformation campaigns that have gone on might constitute a new kind of crime against humanity. And this is not something I've heard a lot boldly proclaimed anyway in religious communities, although I would guess that it's been preached. But nonetheless, that we see repeated misinformation being perpetuated in the media and other places against known facts of climate science. And given what's at stake, I'm not really sure there's any kind of new crime against humanity out there, nothing new under the sun in terms of how bad that people can be to one another. But on the other hand, when the stakes that we see now and the potential for doing harm, given the global consequences of climate change, I think that's what he means here in terms of a new kind of crime. There's a new level of harm that can be done. And so this is an interesting question that's been raised by ethicists recently. And one other thing that I think is kind of interesting to think about and reflect on ourselves is, among Americans, this is also from 2010 from the Yale Climate Project, you see an interesting thing in that Americans recognize that plants and animals and future generations may well suffer from global warming, and that would be a very serious threat. People in developing countries as well, we think, will suffer. People in the United States, well, not quite as much. And interestingly, personally, ourselves, even less. And so there's this issue with climate change. Some people have drawn parallels to climate change and the abolition of slavery as issues that have required major social change and have involved religious communities on both sides of debates, and that have high economic stakes at the same time. And one of the differences, though, is that while the issue of slavery dealt directly with people, the issue of climate change for many people is kind of abstract. You see the data, you see the information, and this is happening somewhere else, and it's hard to act on that. Our instincts are not so good. As David Orr at Oberlin College says, we're really good at dealing with things that are big and hairy and have big teeth and are going to chase us. We react instantly to those kinds of things, but to sort of abstract principles like global climate change, we don't act so fast. And that's an issue, which if you think about the pictures I showed previously about the people in the world who are being impacted, say those in Bangladesh who are being flooded, one of the interesting stories from the Anglican community is that every 10 years the Lambeth Conference is held with all of the Anglican Episcopal bishops from around the world. And in the most recent version of that meeting, the Bishop of Bangladesh, during a conversation about climate change, apparently stood up, sort of pointed his fingers at the Western bishops and said, "Your people are killing our people." And that was a moment, something like that, a moment of putting a face to the impacts in other places, that our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, within our own religious communities in a case like that, are feeling the harm from our own inaction. And both of the bishops of the Episcopal Diocese in Ohio came back with a conviction to do something about climate change to help their brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. And I'll say a little bit more about that. And so here are just a few more examples of response. All of the religious communities have statements that serve as inspiration for how and why to deal with climate change. Here in Ohio, the West Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church had a couple of resolutions a couple years ago. The first one calling for all local congregations to care for creation. And this included a line of saying that we should all do energy audits on our church buildings so that we can become more efficient in our energy use. This mimics a national United Methodist resolution calling on all Methodist buildings to be models of energy efficiency in response to the need to deal with climate issues. They also had an interesting resolution about advocacy regarding care of creation, and it called on all 1,100 or so churches in this conference to work on helping their members speak to their legislators about this important issue and the need for climate legislation. Another example from the Episcopal Diocese of Southern Ohio is their retreat center, the Proctor Camp and Conference Center. They are greening Proctor. They broke ground on an organic garden. They're moving to take the 1,100-acre farm and turn it into an organic farm in the coming years. And so there's a lot of initiatives there. They're looking to put solar panels up, looking to use wind power, and doing a lot to transform that place as a creation care awareness center based on concern for environment and climate change and other issues. In the Diocese of Ohio, which is sort of the northern Episcopal Diocese in Ohio, they had this interesting campaign about how many light bulbs does it take to change an Episcopalian. And this was an effort to change out incandescent bulbs in all the churches of the diocese and replace them with CFLs. And they had a huge impact on reducing climate emissions, carbon emissions as a result of that initiative. Another one, the first solar church in Ohio, in Sylvania, which is near Toledo, the United Church of Christ in Sylvania, has this solar array on the roof. one of their congregants is Al Campan, who was a distinguished professor of physics at the University of Toledo and a leading solar researcher, so that makes it a little bit easier to outfit your church with solar panels. But they have a great display inside the church that gives a readout and shows at any moment how much money and how much energy they're saving and how much less pollution is going into the atmosphere as a result of their efforts. We also have, in Ohio, the nation's first LEED Gold Certified House of Worship, which is in Worcester, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Wayne County. And it's a fantastic building, so they've made a great response with that. And another relatively extraordinary effort, following on the Catholic Coalition on Climate Change's initiative to create the Catholic Climate Covenant, which is known as the St. Francis Pledge to Protect Creation and the Poor. It was issued after Easter of 2009. The Archdiocese of Cincinnati was an inaugural signatory to the pledge and has made some extraordinary efforts at education and action in their archdiocese. I was part of a climate change education day in that diocese where it was scheduled on a Saturday from something like 9 to 4, all day on a Saturday, come out and learn about climate change, which doesn't sound like you might draw very many participants. But representatives from over 60 parishes came to that event. It was huge, and stayed all day to learn about climate change, to engage in thought and prayer and worship and learning and an exchange of action ideas. And a number of these churches now have become involved with the Greater Cincinnati Energy Alliance in getting retrofits and energy audits for their facilities, a major effort which has gained matching funds from the diocese. So too the Episcopal Diocese of Southern Ohio and many other denominations in the area have been involved in that effort. So it's been sort of extraordinary to see that activity in the Cincinnati area. Some other organizations, Green Faith, which is based in New Jersey, currently is running a petition online which you can sign to reduce mercury pollution from power plants, and there are over 10,000 signatories on that right now, faith-based names, and they're looking to continue to draw names to that. And they also have a relatively unique fellowship program that many leaders in religion and environment work across the country are starting to enroll in to train themselves up in getting a better background for dealing with these kinds of issues within faith communities. And the deadline for that is June 15th. I mentioned Interfaith Power and Light. Here's the map of all of the state chapters of Interfaith Power and Light. We have 38 of them now, and more than 10,000 engaged congregations across the country, and even more who have been reached by the message of Interfaith Power and Light. And a couple of wonderful programs that have been sponsored by IPL. One is Cool Congregations, which provides a carbon calculator for congregations and for households. You can go online, enter in the data for your particular church or synagogue or mosque, and it'll punch out a carbon footprint for your congregation. There's also a carbon calculator, either online version or an Excel spreadsheet version for your own household. And the Cool Congregations program that started in Iowa IPL has spread all around the country and is encouraging people to reduce their carbon footprint in their own homes, and gives you sort of a readout of your own electricity use or your heating natural gas use, your automobiles, the garbage you put out, and the flights you may take, and adds that all up and compares you to the U.S. average and to the Kyoto allowance average in helping individuals in their households target where they can become more energy efficient. And then two other programs that IPL is sponsoring. The Cool Harvest program is making the connection between food and faith. The sort of the top 10 list of things you can do to lessen your carbon footprint. The top 5 have to do with transportation and heating your home kind of things. But the next 5 have more to do with food and the energy that's used in making food. And so there's some major efforts here. Cool Harvest program is providing lots of resources here for congregations and individuals who want to start making that connection. And then a very interesting project called the Carbon Covenant, which is linking American congregations with congregations in other parts of the world who are facing particular harsh impacts of climate change. So there right now are 4 model projects that American congregations or individuals can get involved with and help support, whether that's reforestation in Cambodia or stopping desertification in the Cameroon and in Ghana. And there's also a major effort to plant trees on Kilimanjaro. So that's a relatively novel project. Last couple of comments before we can open up to question and answer. Climate change can be a very contentious issue, and the Catholic bishops as far back as 2001 were noting that the debate tends to be polarized and partisan, and this really stands in the way of making progress on issues like this. It's unfortunate that science often gets used sort of as a weapon, they say, instead of as a source of wisdom, and that the media tends to play into this, and politics plays into this. So it can be a real mess, and this kind of contentious debate that we tend to see in the U.S. around an issue like climate change tends to overshadow then larger notions of the common good. The voices of poor people get neglected. And so they've got this video of who's under your carbon footprint to try to raise awareness for this in association with that St. Francis pledge. Now, I just want to close, here in Columbus, when we think about ethics, one of the things that's been in the news lately, of course, is the ethical dilemmas that Ohio State has faced with Coach Tressel having to resign, and it is particularly painful to those of us in Columbus when something like people in Ann Arbor start writing about this in their religion columns. But it's very interesting that the same day that this news broke of Tressel taking the heat and having to resign, on that very same day, Tuesday, May 31st of this year, came an article in the Columbus Dispatch about the health alert because of smog and heat. And if you look down below at this article, there's a little bit of information about why smog forms on windless days when the sun cooks pollutants from cars, trucks, power plants, and factories. Of course, these are the same pollutants that are greenhouse emissions that we're trying to curb. And it can harm lung tissue, help trigger asthma attacks, and worsen lung diseases. And, of course, so the advisory is particularly for older people, children, and those with breathing problems to monitor and limit outdoor activity. And furthermore, there's a cartoon here we had last year, but it applies equally this year. This year we found out that Ohio leads the nation on the EPA's list of air pollution, but this was also true in terms of particulates a year or two ago. Ohio leads the nation. I always kind of say, hey, go Bucks, we're number one. We've kind of know that we've got our work cut out for us here. And what I like to point out is no matter what a person thinks about climate change, whether it's a kind of a contentious issue in someone's community or whether you're fairly convinced that the science is settled, I personally have my own reasons, a set of reasons that I think are particularly important for wanting to deal with these issues. And it's my children, and here's my children and my grandmother who are being advised on these hot days that they should not go outside so that they can not be harmed. And I think most of us would probably agree that we'd like a world where our kids are allowed to go outside without being harmed by the air. Or I look at this picture, and this is the day that my youngest son Hayden was born. This was his older brother Eli's first response. He wanted to give him a kiss. And I think there's something absolutely and essentially beautiful about human beings and about the flourishing life that we desire and that we want for all of us. We're full of life. I always laugh about this. You buy your kids toys, and all they want to do is play in the box. They don't need much. But at the time of this photo, Hayden, the youngest, was still breastfeeding. And if you know anything about what is now found in breast milk, you know that some toxins and things like flame retardants have worked their way up through biological systems into mother's breast milk. And I think, well, kids don't need much, but I'd like them to be able to drink their mother's breast milk without worry of damage to their systems. I'd like them to be able to go outside and just breathe the air without there being problems. I'd like to go fishing with my boys and make sure that I can catch and eat those fish that we get, but I have to check the fish advisory consumption advisories in my state and in every state of this country to check which fish we're allowed to eat and how much of it, because there again, children and pregnant women and elderly are more vulnerable to the mercury levels in the fish. And those mercury levels come from the coal we burn, which falls back down to earth and makes its way into the streams and works its way up into the tissues of the fish. So these issues are not interrelated. I think no matter what someone thinks about climate change and global warming, there are so many interrelated issues about how we're living, and we know we need to do better. And this is something that I think that all of our wisdom traditions can agree upon. So with that, I just want to mention some special thanks to people whose slides I've borrowed here and information I've borrowed from many sources. But I also just want to conclude by saying that it's clear that in some parts of the United States and even within some religious communities, climate change can be a bit of a contentious issue. But by and large, there's an overwhelming consensus and a lot of work that's being done in faith communities to contribute to this issue. And I've heard the analogy made that if you were a parent who was worried about your child's health, and you took your child to the doctor's office, and the doctor said, ooh, child's not doing well, you need to respond, you need to treat your child. And you said, I think I'll get a second opinion. So you took your child to another doctor, and they said the same thing. And so you took your child to another doctor and another doctor. You took your child, say, to 10 doctors, and 9 of those doctors said, you have an issue. Your child is not well. You need to treat your child. And one of those doctors said, no, I don't think there's a problem. What kind of parent would you be if you listened to the one doctor and ignored the 9? And the obvious parallel, of course, is what kind of citizens are we if in the climate debates that seem to have descended upon the U.S., if we listen to the voice, if we listen only to the clamor of those who reject climate science and ignore the overwhelming consensus on this, what kind of citizens are we? I think in the case of climate science, it's more like 99 to 1 than 9 to 1. But I think these are serious issues because of those kinds of realities. And I hope that religious communities' contributions, together with good science and good policy, can all be part of the solution to these larger issues. And so with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Well, thanks, Greg. Yeah, we'll go ahead. We've got several questions, and the first is just about kind of fall into the realm of outreach. Several people had questions related to what are some of the effective ways you see for scientists and outreach professionals to engage with faith leaders on the issues of climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, when we're seeing that, the Ecological Society of America actually right now is working on an initiative to start a speakers bureau to faith communities for Earth stewardship. And one of the things that scientists, I think, can do is take a note. Here also is a graph I've just put up from the interview with the IPL leaders around the country, finding different themes that particularly resonate with faith communities. And these moral issues of stewardship and eco-justice really top the list. But other things are important. You know, people are concerned about energy efficiency and concerned about climate science. So I think in a lot of cases it can be really nice if you can do outreach to a church or a synagogue that's interested in information about climate change. It's nice to be able to partner with somebody in the faith community who might be able to talk some and frame things in terms of the moral and ethical dimensions, but then to be able to speak as a scientist to the science issues. There's a huge interest in clarifying the science. One example of this, in fact, is some of the contention within particularly conservative evangelical communities about environmental issues is that conservatives don't want to get caught jumping on some kind of liberal bandwagon. And in many cases, environmental groups are seen as being liberally biased, whereas scientists are more objective. And so I think there's a real need, maybe particularly in conservative communities, to get good scientific information from scientists who have a more objective perspective, and there's no concern there that there's some kind of political bias. So I think that scientists, can start reaching out in that way, knowing that there is a demand and a desire from faith communities for good science. And if that can be done in one's own faith community or faith community of friends or going through those kinds of networks, maybe working with the Ecological Society of America on this new initiative, that would be a great way to do effective outreach.
Okay, and then I had another question about involvement of any religious communities in actually giving ideas related to adaptation or other policy that deal with the issues that you've discussed they may be interested in terms of equity and those. So that's the question.
Yeah, well, so for instance, that's been one of the major lobbying points of the Catholic bishops, and I'll see if I can find a slide here that gets us that. This was from that February 2011 letter in terms of prioritizing the needs of the poor and vulnerable. One thing that's been established is this Green Climate Fund, and the idea is to get $100 billion in that by 2020 to help poor countries adapt and mitigate. And groups like Catholic Relief Services or World Vision or Lutheran Relief Services, there are so many relief agencies around the world that are religiously sponsored, can all participate in this, but we've seen a budget crunch on this. The National Council of Churches came out with a report several years ago looking at the needs of some of these relief agencies, and that they were experiencing so much environmental refugeeism that they were going to need 6 times the budget that they currently have. So this is some of the same need. A lot of people don't think about this, but it impacts some of these church ministries very heavily when they have so much that they have to draw attention to. So one of the things that can be done is to try to bring more expertise to address some of the environmental problems that are seen here. And that's what some relief agencies have decided to do, is focus more on water pollution as a source of health problems in developing countries, or air pollution or climate impacts, because by addressing those issues rather than just bringing aid and trying to have stopgap health measures, we need to really be working on some of the things that are causing the problems and building infrastructure in other ways. So there's that kind of effort. There are other efforts. I know that there's a group, I think they're called something like adventconspiracy.org, and their basic message is around the holidays, the Christmas holidays in America, an awful lot of money gets spent, oftentimes on gifts that nobody really wants, and the sort of the consumerism and the materialism around that is probably not quite what people meant by the wise men bringing gifts to the child in the manger. And so they simply point out that out of the billions and billions of dollars that are spent on gifts in the holiday season, a much smaller number of $1 billion would solve the clean water problems in the developing world. And so there are projects out there that are trying to receive donations to make sure that there's just clean water for communities in developing nations. So I think that's possible. But also just the carbon covenant that I mentioned that Interfaith Power and Light supports, that's an opportunity to directly connect with 4 different projects in developing countries and become involved as an individual or a congregation in helping those people in other parts of the world adapt. So there's all of those kinds of projects that they get involved in, and as I said, a lot of the impact that some interfaith communities have had in lobbying on climate legislation has been to hold up these issues and say that whatever legislation we eventually pass on climate, we need to make sure that it includes the kind of support that's necessary for adaptation in places where people are feeling these impacts the most.
Well, thank you, Greg, and I want to thank all of our participants for an excellent presentation and discussion. We'd also like to thank NOAA's National Sea Grant College Program and the OSU Department of Agriculture, Environmental, and Development Economics for funding this webinar. This presentation and related education materials will be posted at the Changing Climate website. We really would appreciate if you would let us know what you thought about today's webinar. There is a very short evaluation that is now available at the link located in the chat box that we would like you to complete immediately following today's webinar. I also want to refer you to resources and an archive of all previous webinar presentations on changingclimate.osu.edu. Again, this webinar series is sponsored by the OSU Climate Change Outreach Team and will continue again monthly at the beginning of the new academic year in September. I want to thank everyone who joined us today and for our presenters and support staff. Thank you and have a great afternoon.